This episode is proudly sponsored by Hasa, the trusted choice for liquid chlorine. It's better because it offers the highest purity, works instantly, and contains no added CYA. By the bottom feeder, professional-grade battery-powered swimming pool vacuum system, it sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off the bottom feeder with code DVB100. Skimmer, trusted by over 30,000 pool service professionals across North America. Skimmer software helps you save time, grow revenue, and boost your 5-star reviews. Whether you're just starting out or expanding your team, Skimmer's easy-to-use tools and expert support have you covered. Upgrade your business in 2025 with Skimmer. Try Skimmer for 30 days for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, and welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about some common issues you will have with your saltwater generator. If you have one, you're probably familiar with some of these issues, or if you do pool service, you're familiar with these issues. If you don't have one, it's not something that I'm discouraging you from getting. I hope I don't discourage you too much because I like saltwater generators. I think the convenience factor is really great, but there are things that can go wrong with just about any product, and saltwater generators are not excluded from these issues. Join my coaching program and take your pool service to the next level. Connect with other pool pros in your area, gain valuable knowledge, and transform your business with personalized one-on-one advice from me. With over 36 years of experience, I'm here to help you succeed like never before. Learn more at poolguycoaching.com. It's interesting, I was talking to one of the members of my group at the pool show about this, and saltwater generators technically don't work really well in cold water. They're all a little bit different as far as the ratings for the water temperature of when they stop producing chlorine. But basically, electricity doesn't conduct really well in cold water. And so in the winter months here in California, December, probably all the way through March, you'll have to find an alternate sanitizer, which I highly recommend you use liquid chlorine because it's very similar in chemistry and makeup to a saltwater generator. Basically, the byproduct of liquid chlorine is salt, and so it's something that's not going to really affect the pool water. You can also use dichlor. Dichlor is a great way to add some cyanuric acid to the pool and chlorine, or you can get a floater and put a trichlor tablet in there and let that slowly dissolve. You would probably use one tablet every 2 or 3 weeks, and that will add a little bit of cyanuric acid to the water as well. So whichever sanitizer you choose to use, the saltwater generator is a seasonal product. So that's one thing you should know, is that it's going to work when the water is warm and hot, and it's not going to work when the water gets cold. But it was interesting when I was talking to him that he has the same experience I have, is that you can have the exact salt system, let's just say a Hayward Aquarite salt system, at one pool where it's too cold, it's not producing, or even an iChlor that's flashing red, cold water. And then you can be, 2 blocks away at another pool and it's still operating. You would think that the water temperature 2 or 3 blocks away or a mile away is the same in that pool as in the other. So I think the sensor probably isn't kind of fine-tuned to the point where, it's going to be exact at every pool, but it will not produce chlorine or not operate when the water temperature gets to a certain point where it can't conduct the electricity, because it is a little chlorine factory and it needs some kind of conductivity to achieve making chlorine in the pool. So on the flip side, another issue you're going to run into is superchlorination or hyperchlorination, or too much chlorine being produced by these systems. And it's interesting that this problem happens because it is too effective. And what I mean by this is that you have to kind of really adjust the output to where you're getting a good chlorine level. I'm thinking anywhere from 3 to 6 parts per million would be acceptable as a chlorine level in a saltwater pool. And sometimes you're getting 10 parts per million or even 20 parts per million. There was a customer with a saltwater pool where he showed me the bathing suit, and it was like totally bleached out, and I'm like, wow, I wonder what the saltwater generator is at. It was like, I couldn't even get a chlorine reading. It was so high in that pool. One of the things that is interesting is that because the saltwater generator doesn't really rely on any kind of stabilized chlorine, like for instance, trichlor and dichlor, I mentioned those two because they have cyanuric acid in it. And a lot of these pools with trichlor tablets, I'll just use that as my primary example here. The cyanuric acid level sometimes is 100 parts per million or even 200 parts per million, which, the myth of chlorine lock, where the chlorine is locked up and ineffective, has kind of been put to rest here. But it does make the chlorine less effective, or it makes it, if you have, 20 parts per million in a pool and your cyanuric acid level is at 200 parts per million, all of that 20 parts per million is not really in the water. Maybe a fraction of that is actually in the water itself. But if you have a saltwater pool and you have your cyanuric acid level or conditioner level or CYA at 50 parts per million and you're at 30 parts per million of free chlorine, there's a lot of free chlorine in the water at that point. So that's why having the saltwater generator producing too much chlorine is actually a real problem in the industry, and a real problem for you. And as a pool service provider, it's a problem that can be rectified by adjusting the output of the chlorinator. Now, you can adjust it in several ways. The easiest way, of course, is to lower the percentage of output depending on which system you have. Either it's a dial or a button to push it to lower the output. And one thing I recommend, if you are at like 20 or 30 parts per million, just unplug the salt system, unplug the cell from the power unit, and just leave the pool alone for a little bit and let the chlorine level drop down. Now you can add a chlorine neutralizer, but I find that sometimes it does too good of a job. I would just, if no one's using it, just let it drop down gradually, because you're not having the saltwater generator working for a week or so, and let that kind of dilute itself or dissipate or burn off by the sun's UV rays, however you want to look at it. It will eventually drop down just by the nature of not adding more chlorine to the pool. And then you want to adjust the output down. I usually start at 50%, and then I'll go up or down depending on if the pool has too much chlorine or too little chlorine in the pool. And I should make a slight correction to what I was saying just briefly a few minutes ago. It's the active chlorine in the pool. If you have a lot of cyanuric acid, it's kind of locking up the free chlorine, and it's not as much active chlorine as if the cyanuric acid level was lower. So that's why the 30 parts per million in a saltwater pool is a lot more powerful than 30 parts per million in a pool that has 200 parts per million of cyanuric acid from trichlor tablets. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit, but that is a real problem. So reduce the output, bring it down, and make sure that you don't have it set too high. You can look at the manual for the system, and depending, like I think for instance the Pentair IC40 or IntelliChlor 40 makes like 1.2 pounds of chlorine in a 24-hour period. That's running at 3450 RPMs for a 24-hour period. So if you just kind of do a logic and you reduce that, let's say you have your pool running for 12 hours a day and you're running at full speed, you're probably producing about 8 pounds or 9 pounds of chlorine, or 0.9 pounds, I should say. Not 9 pounds, that's a lot of chlorine. So 0.9 or half of what I just said, the 1.2 pounds of chlorine. My math is a little bit crazy at this moment, but you kind of get the idea that you're just cutting that in half. And then you can equate that with liquid chlorine. So not technically straight across the board, because it's not an exact way of kind of calculating, but it works fairly effectively that 1 pound of chlorine produced by the salt system is equivalent to about 1 gallon of the 12.5% liquid chlorine, like the one HASA produces. And it's something that I kind of use, generally speaking. You can say that 1 gallon of liquid chlorine is equivalent roughly. And so, do you need to pour a complete gallon of liquid chlorine into your pool every day? Probably not. Half a gallon of it, I think that's acceptable in a lot of cases, especially in the middle of summer. They use that amount of chlorine in the pool. So that's one thing that could be problematic, is getting it adjusted correctly. And it may take 2 or 3 weeks to adjust the chlorine to where you have the output set correctly. So it's not like you can plug in the salt system and it's going to work perfectly fine without you making some kind of fine tuning and some adjustments there. Another problem that develops is that depending on your area, this is very area dependent. There's some areas where no calcium buildup happens on the plates in the salt system or the salt cell. There's other areas, like my area, where hard water is a big issue. In fact, I remember that I was changing out the aerator in one of my bathroom sinks because it just wasn't working properly. And the calcium was so bad that it actually ruined the threaded part of the aerator, so I had to buy a whole new faucet at that point. That's how hard the water is in my area. And so yes, the calcium buildup on the salt cell plates is very prevalent in my service area. Some pools, every month and a half, the salt cell needs to be washed in a water acid solution, sometimes every 3 months. Now, one thing you should know is that the Hayward Aquarite system, no matter if there is buildup on the salt cell, and by the way, am I the only one that thinks that the Aquarite salt cell is kind of weird? When you look inside there, it looks like it's white plastic, but there's actually plates in there somewhere, I guess, I assume. But to me, it's kind of odd compared to other salt systems when you look in there and you see metal, and then the Aquarite, you see plastic. But needless to say, the point is that the Aquarite systems, every 3 months, you're going to get a check inspect cell light flashing. It's really irritating, and it doesn't help you in any way, in my opinion, to have that come on. And so you have to hold the reset button down for, I think, 5 seconds to turn that off. And so the salt cell not necessarily is dirty. It's just that every 3 months it comes on, just so you know that it's 3 months, check the cell. That may not be necessary in your area. To me, it's just a major irritant. I can tell when the cell is dirty usually because with the Aquarite system, the salt level drops down pretty dramatically for whatever reason. There's other ones like the iChlor that tell you when the cell is dirty. Same with the Pentair iChlor and Telechlor. They'll flash when the cell is dirty. So the Jandy TruClear is one of my favorite salt systems because you have a clear lid on top and you can actually see the buildup in the salt in the plates, so you don't have to take it off. You can just look in the little window and be like, yep, it's got a lot of calcium buildup. So with the calcium buildup, and I just mentioned that it uses electricity and there's metal plates, if the plates have calcium on them, it's not going to be very conductive. And that's why when the calcium builds up to a certain level, the saltwater system does not produce chlorine or produces it in very small amounts. So this requires a cleaning of the salt cell, and depending on your manufacturer is how much acid to water ratio you would want to use for this. So some manufacturers are a 20-to-1 solution, others may be a stronger acid to water solution. Check your manual to see how much acid to water you're going to need to use. I really think that this is something that you should be charging for if you do service. I have neglected to do this, unfortunately, but a lot of pool guys do charge for this. It does take time, and it's something that you should be compensated for, cleaning the salt cell at the customer's homes. And it's something that takes some effort, sometimes a lot of effort. If the unions aren't straight and you got to get one of these salt cells off, it's almost near impossible. And you have to be careful you don't crack a union. Of course, if you do crack a union, you have Mikey's quick couplers. You can order those. I did a video on these things, and they kind of go together like Legos, and you put them on there without having to replumb anything. But you don't want to crack a union. But cleaning the salt cell is something that needs to be done, depending on your area, every 1.5 months, believe it or not, 3 months, 6 months. Some areas I've heard pool guys say they don't clean them for a year and a half. That's great, and you're in a great area where you don't have to worry about that. But typically you have to clean them more often than not in most cases. So you're going to have to understand that if there is calcium buildup, the saltwater system will not work. And then another thing to consider is the lifespan of the saltwater cell itself. Now, I used to say, and this is something that I'm changing my philosophy a little bit on, not entirely and not for every system, but I used to say that you would want to buy a larger saltwater system cell rated for more gallons because then you can lower the output and the cell can last longer. I've done a lot of podcasts on this, but I'll briefly say that if you have a 15,000 gallon pool, you're better off with a salt cell that's rated for 30,000 or 40,000 gallons versus a salt cell that's rated for 20,000 gallons for a number of reasons, mainly because you can superchlorinate that pool, or you can produce enough chlorine for that pool because you're kind of doubling the chlorine output for what you need. And so theoretically, if you lower that down to 50% and you have a salt cell on a 15,000 gallon pool rated for 30,000 gallons, you're going to extend the life of that salt cell. But I was recently kind of chastised for this thinking because one thing that I didn't account for was the poor manufacturing quality of these salt cells. And I'm not going to call out any company in particular, but the quality of these salt cells have deteriorated from certain manufacturers. So me saying that you should buy a salt cell rated for 40,000 gallons for a 20,000 gallon pool logically is a great idea because then you're going to extend the life of the salt cell. But if that salt cell is not manufactured to last longer, even with the lower output, you're kind of wasting your money getting the larger cell. I still recommend getting a larger cell because it's easier to adjust the chlorine level up higher than if the cell was like rated right for your pool size. You're kind of on the needle's edge right there. And so if you're having trouble getting chlorine produced or staying in the pool, then you have too small of a salt cell to work with, and you can't do much except run your pool, longer to get more production out of it. But if you had a larger salt cell, you can easily get more production out of it because it's rated for more chlorine than you're ever going to need for your pool size. But yes, the manufacturers aren't helping me when I say get a salt cell that's bigger and it's going to last longer because you're using it less. And these can be really expensive for sure. So, understand that in theory, what I'm saying works, and I still recommend the larger salt cell just because it can produce more chlorine for your pool. And last is that I mentioned at the beginning that the saltwater generator doesn't rely on any kind of conditioner or stabilizer or cyanuric acid because it's making really pure chlorine, which means that you theoretically need to keep a higher cyanuric acid level in the pool to make this effective. Now, people ask me, well, why do you have to keep a cyanuric acid level of 80 parts per million when everyone recommends maximum 50 parts per million for a regular pool? And that's basically because of how the chlorine is injected into the pool. Typically, it's coming out of 2 or 3 return jets, and it's in a concentrated form coming into the pool. And what happens if you don't have a higher cyanuric acid level when 10 parts per million of that chlorine is coming out of the return line, or even 15 parts per million? I don't even know how strong it is, to tell you the truth. I know it's in a really concentrated form at this point. The UV rays, if you're in Texas where the UV index is unchartable, is so high, there's nothing protecting that concentrated chlorine coming into the pool. But if you have the cyanuric acid at 80 parts per million, there's a good chance that a lot of that is still being protected, at least 8 parts per million, and it's one way to ensure that the chlorine is going to kind of stick in the pool when it's being produced. Now, I've been in the industry long enough to where I've talked to representatives of companies way at the beginning when these saltwater generators came out, and believe it or not, the prevailing thing I got from them, this is 20 years ago, that you don't really need a lot of cyanuric acid with the saltwater generator because it's always producing chlorine. And so some of them even said you don't need any cyanuric acid at the beginning. Some said, 30 parts per million is perfectly fine because it's always generating chlorine. And so whatever's burned off is going to be replaced. But I think the theory is that because it comes out of the return line in such a concentrated way, you do need a higher cyanuric acid level to protect at least the chlorine coming into the pool at that point. So the prevailing theory is that a higher cyanuric acid is better than a lower cyanuric acid for that reason. Now, I barely kind of touched the surface on problems And I'll probably do a follow-up on this to kind of go into more detail. But those are kind of the things that to be aware of when you have a saltwater generator, and some things that may cause you problems. Nothing major, I don't think, but these are things to be aware of. If you're looking for other podcasts that I've recorded, you can find those on my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. On the banner, click on the podcast icon, and there'll be a drop-down menu of other podcasts there for you as well. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.